who kept getting away with sabotage because everyone trusted them too much. Dr. Amelia Frost had been our hospital's chief pharmacist for 11 years when the first patient died. Nobody suspected her because she was the person who caught medication errors made by other staff, the one who'd implemented our safety protocols, the woman who stayed late reviewing prescriptions to prevent exactly the kind of mistake that killed Gerald Thompson. The 72-year-old had been recovering well from knee surgery when his heart stopped during a routine medication round. The autopsy showed lethal levels of potassium in his system, 10 times the prescribed dose. Our hospital administrator called it a tragic dispensing error and launched an investigation that cleared Dr. Frost within 48 hours. She'd personally reviewed the medication order and flagged it as correct in our system. The error must have happened during administration, the report concluded, and the night nurse who'd given the injection was placed on administrative leave pending further review. I was a floor nurse on the surgical unit where Gerald died, and something about the investigation bothered me from the beginning. The night nurse they suspended was Keisha Brooks, one of the most meticulous people I'd ever worked with. She triple-checked everything, called pharmacy with questions about medications she wasn't completely certain about, and had worked at our hospital for 8 years without a single error. The idea that she'd accidentally given 10 times the correct potassium dose didn't match the person I knew. But when I mentioned my concerns to our unit supervisor, she reminded me that Dr. Frost had verified the original order as correct, which meant the error happened somewhere between pharmacy and patient. Keisha was the obvious weak link in that chain, and the hospital needed someone to blame to satisfy the family's potential lawsuit. The second death happened 6 weeks later. Patricia Donnelly was a 48-year-old woman being treated for a severe infection when she went into respiratory arrest during the night shift. The crash team couldn't save her, and the autopsy revealed she'd received a massive overdose of fentanyl, far exceeding what her pain management plan called for. Once again, Dr. Frost had verified the original prescription as appropriate and within normal ranges. Once again, the medication had been administered during the night shift when staffing was thinner and oversight was minimal. This time they suspended 2 nurses, and rumors started spreading through our hospital about incompetent night staff who couldn't be trusted with basic medication administration. Dr. Frost gave a presentation at our next staff meeting about the importance of following protocols and double-checking dosages, her voice full of concern for patient safety and disappointment in her colleagues' failures. I started keeping my own records after Patricia's death. Nothing formal or official, just notes in a private journal about medication errors, unusual incidents, and patterns I noticed during my shifts. I wrote down that both deaths had occurred on nights when Dr. Frost had personally delivered medications to our unit, instead of using our normal courier system. I noted that both patients had been doing well before their sudden declines, with no indication in their charts that they were at risk for the complications that killed them. I documented that Keisha Brooks had been cleared of wrongdoing after the hospital's insurance company reviewed her case, but she'd already quit rather than return to a workplace where everyone believed she'd killed someone. The pattern was thin, barely visible, but it existed if you knew where to look. The third incident wasn't a death, but should have been. Daniel Okafor was a 35-year-old construction worker recovering from a workplace injury when he started seizing violently during morning rounds. We got him stabilized and discovered he'd received triple his prescribed dose of a medication that could cause seizures at high levels. The pharmacy records showed the correct dosage had been entered into our system, verified by Dr. Frost personally, but what Daniel received was something else entirely. This time, the hospital brought in an outside consultant to review our medication dispensing procedures, and Dr. Frost cooperated fully with the investigation. She opened her pharmacy records, walked investigators through her verification process, and even suggested additional safety measures we could implement. The consultant's report praised her dedication to patient safety and recommended we install cameras in medication preparation areas to catch future errors before they reached patients. Dr. Frost opposed the camera installation. She argued during hospital board meetings that surveillance would create a culture of distrust and micromanagement that would drive away talented staff. She said pharmacists needed to focus on their work, not worry about being watched constantly for mistakes. Several board members agreed with her, particularly the ones who'd worked with her for years and trusted her professional judgment completely. I attended one of those meetings as a staff representative and watched her performance with growing unease. She was convincing, articulate, and genuinely seemed concerned about staff morale and patient safety. If I hadn't been keeping my private records, I might have believed her completely. But I'd noticed that all 3 incidents had occurred on nights when she'd personally handled medication delivery, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't want cameras because they might catch something she didn't want anyone to see. The hospital installed cameras anyway after the consultant made it a firm recommendation tied to our accreditation status. Dr. Frost accepted the decision gracefully and even helped plan the camera placement to ensure they captured all critical areas. She suggested angles and locations that would provide the best coverage of medication preparation and dispensing, demonstrating her supposed commitment to transparency. The cameras went live on a Monday morning, and for the next 2 months, nothing unusual happened. No overdoses, no medication errors, no unexplained patient complications. Hospital administration pointed to this as proof that the cameras were working as intended, creating accountability that prevented mistakes. Dr. Frost received a commendation for her cooperation and continued leadership in patient safety initiatives. Then a camera malfunctioned during a night shift when Dr. Frost was working late. The camera covering the main medication preparation area went offline around 10 p.m., and our IT department was notified automatically. They sent a technician who arrived around midnight to find Dr. Frost already troubleshooting the issue. She explained that she'd noticed the camera wasn't recording and had checked the connections herself before calling IT. The technician reset the system and got everything running again within 20 minutes. He filed a report noting that the camera's power cable had become loose, probably from routine vibrations or someone bumping the equipment. The incident seemed minor and completely explained until 3 days later, when a patient named Victor Alvarez died from an unexplained cardiac arrest during recovery from routine gallbladder surgery. Victor's autopsy showed he'd received a medication combination that should never have been given together, a deadly interaction that any competent pharmacist would catch immediately. The hospital's medication system had safeguards specifically designed to flag dangerous drug combinations, but somehow Victor had received both medications anyway. Dr. Frost reviewed the records and discovered that a pharmacy resident had overridden the safety warning, assuming it was a false positive because the system sometimes flagged interactions that weren't actually dangerous in specific clinical contexts. The resident was devastated, crying during the investigation as she explained that she'd thought she was helping by not bothering Dr. Frost with a routine warning. She was suspended immediately, and criminal charges were being considered because her override had directly caused a patient's death. I pulled the camera footage from the night Victor received his fatal medications. The timing was perfect for my theory, but terrible for proving anything. The medications had been prepared during the 20-minute window when the camera was offline being repaired. Dr. Frost had been present in the pharmacy during that time, along with the resident and 2 other staff members. The footage showed Dr. Frost troubleshooting the camera, then leaving briefly to speak with the IT technician in the hallway, then returning to help the resident with medication preparation after the camera came back online. There was nothing suspicious in her behavior, nothing that suggested she'd done anything wrong. But the timing bothered me immensely. 4 serious medication incidents, and 3 of them had occurred during unusual circumstances that made it impossible to verify exactly what happened. I started researching Dr. Frost's background, using my off hours to dig through public records and professional licensing databases. She'd graduated from a prestigious pharmacy school 15 years ago with excellent grades and strong recommendations. She'd worked at 2 other hospitals before joining ours, staying about 3 years at each position before moving on to better opportunities. I called a contact I had at her previous hospital, a nurse I'd met at a conference, and asked casually if she remembered Dr. Frost. My contact said yes, that Dr. Frost had been well-respected and professional, though she'd left somewhat suddenly after a patient death that turned out to be a medication error. The nurse who'd administered the fatal dose had been fired, and Dr. Frost had moved on shortly afterward. My contact didn't remember the details clearly since it had been 7 years ago, but she recalled thinking at the time that the whole situation seemed odd. I contacted the hospital before that one, claiming to be verifying Dr. Frost's employment history for a professional reference. The HR representative I spoke with confirmed she'd worked there from 2007 to 2010 in their pharmacy department. When I asked why she'd left, there was a pause before the representative said Dr. Frost had resigned voluntarily to pursue other opportunities. I pushed gently, saying I was specifically interested in any disciplinary issues or performance concerns, and the representative's voice got careful as she told me there had been an incident involving a patient death from a medication error, but Dr. Frost had been cleared of any wrongdoing. The error had been attributed to a pharmacy technician who'd been terminated. I thanked her and hung up, then sat staring at my notes, feeling cold spreading through my chest. 3 hospitals, at least 6 suspicious deaths, and Dr. Frost had been present for all of them while someone else always took the blame. I needed to talk to someone about what I'd discovered, but I wasn't sure who would believe me. Dr. Frost was beloved at our hospital, respected in her field, and had spent 11 years building relationships with administrators and staff. I was a floor nurse with no investigative training and a theory based on patterns and coincidences that could easily be explained away. I decided to approach our hospital's risk management director, a woman named Constance Hart, who'd worked in healthcare for 30 years and had a reputation for taking safety concerns seriously. I scheduled a meeting with her, saying I had questions about our medication safety protocols and wanted her perspective on some incidents I'd noticed. She agreed to meet me the following week in her office where we could speak privately. Constance listened to my entire presentation without interrupting. I'd brought my journal with detailed notes about each incident, timelines showing Dr. Frost's presence during critical moments, and information about the suspicious deaths at her previous hospitals. Constance's expression remained neutral as I talked, giving me no indication whether she thought I was onto something real or wasting her time with paranoid conspiracy theories. When I finished, she asked if I'd shared these concerns with anyone else, and I told her no. I'd come to her first because I trusted her judgment and didn't want to damage Dr. Frost's reputation without cause. Constance nodded slowly and said she appreciated my discretion and would look into my concerns quietly. She asked me not to discuss this with anyone else until she'd had time to investigate, and I agreed even though her neutral tone made me worry she thought I was crazy. 2 days later, Constance called me into her office again. This time our hospital administrator was there, along with our chief medical officer and the director of pharmacy operations. My stomach dropped because I realized this meeting wasn't going to be the supportive investigation I'd hoped for. The administrator told me that Dr. Frost had been informed of my allegations and was deeply hurt that a colleague would make such serious accusations based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. He said my theory showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how medication errors occur and demonstrated bias against a respected professional who dedicated her career to preventing exactly the kind of tragedies I was accusing her of causing. The pharmacy director added that Dr. Frost had offered to meet with me personally to address my concerns and help me understand the complexities of pharmaceutical safety that I clearly didn't grasp as a floor nurse. I asked if anyone had actually investigated the pattern I'd identified or contacted her previous hospitals to verify the deaths I'd mentioned. Constance spoke up then, saying she'd made preliminary inquiries and found that medication errors occurred at every hospital, that patient deaths from medication mistakes were tragic but not uncommon, and that blaming one person for systemic problems was inappropriate and potentially defamatory. She said she understood I was concerned about patient safety, but I needed to be careful about making accusations that could destroy someone's career and expose the hospital to liability. If Dr. Frost decided to sue for defamation, the chief medical officer suggested I take a few days off to decompress from the stress of working in a high-stakes environment where patient deaths occurred regularly. He made it sound like concern for my well-being, but I heard the threat underneath: back off or face consequences. I took the suggested time off and spent it making copies of all my research and notes. I documented everything in multiple formats, uploaded files to secure cloud storage, and prepared a detailed report with timelines and supporting evidence. If the hospital wasn't going to investigate seriously, I needed to find someone who would. I researched the state medical board's complaint process and discovered they had an anonymous reporting system for concerns about healthcare professionals. I filed a formal complaint about Dr. Frost, attaching my documentation and specifically requesting they review the pattern of deaths at her current and previous hospitals. The submission went through, and I received an automated response saying my complaint would be reviewed within 60 days. 60 days felt like forever when I was convinced Dr. Frost would kill someone else before anyone took my concerns seriously. I returned to work to find my schedule had been changed. Instead of my usual surgical unit shifts where I'd worked for 5 years, I'd been transferred to the pediatric unit on the opposite side of the hospital. My unit supervisor explained that they thought I'd benefit from a change of environment, and the pediatric unit needed experienced nurses to cover some gaps in their staffing. The transfer meant I'd be working completely different hours with completely different patients, effectively separating me from the surgical unit where all the suspicious deaths had occurred. It also meant I wouldn't be working anywhere near the pharmacy or Dr. Frost. The message was clear. I'd been removed from the situation and isolated where I couldn't cause more trouble. The pediatric unit was fine, and the staff were friendly enough, but I felt like I was going crazy watching the days tick by with no action from the medical board. I checked the news compulsively for reports of medication errors at our hospital, terrified I'd see another death that I could have prevented if anyone had listened to me. My coworkers started giving me strange looks when I'd zone out during conversations, clearly distracted by thoughts I couldn't share. One of the senior pediatric nurses pulled me aside after a shift and asked if I was okay, saying I seemed stressed and unfocused. I told her I was fine, just adjusting to the new unit, but she looked unconvinced. That night, I barely slept, lying awake wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by filing the complaint, or if I should have pushed harder, gone to the media, done something more dramatic to stop what I was convinced was happening. Week 6 after my complaint, I got a call from an investigator with the state medical board named Julian Reeves. He said he'd been assigned to review my allegations against Dr. Frost and wanted to interview me in person about the incidents I'd documented. We met at a coffee shop 30 minutes from the hospital, where no one would recognize us. Julian was in his 50s with gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many cases like this. He asked me to walk through everything from the beginning, taking notes and asking clarifying questions about timelines and evidence. When I finished, he told me I wasn't the first person to raise concerns about Dr. Frost. He'd received another anonymous complaint about her 2 years ago, but it hadn't included enough specific information to warrant a full investigation. My complaint, combined with the previous one, had triggered a formal review. Julian explained that investigating a licensed professional was complicated and time-consuming. They needed to gather medical records, interview witnesses, review hospital policies, and document everything meticulously to build a case that would stand up if challenged legally. Dr. Frost had powerful allies and an excellent reputation, which meant the medical board needed absolutely ironclad evidence before taking any action that could damage her career. He estimated the investigation would take 4 to 6 months minimum, possibly longer if Dr. Frost fought back with lawyers and expert witnesses. I asked what happened to patients during those months while she continued working, and Julian's expression told me he'd been asked that question before and didn't have a good answer. He said the board couldn't suspend someone's license without proof of immediate danger, and my evidence, while concerning, was circumstantial and open to interpretation. I went back to work feeling defeated and anxious. 6 months of investigation while Dr. Frost continued preparing medications and working with vulnerable patients felt like an eternity. I started watching the hospital's incident reports obsessively, checking daily for any unusual patient outcomes that might indicate another problem. 3 weeks after my meeting with Julian, there was a close call. A patient received the wrong antibiotic and went into anaphylactic shock, but the floor staff caught it quickly and administered epinephrine before any permanent damage occurred. The incident report showed the medication had been prepared in the pharmacy during Dr. Frost's shift, but she hadn't personally prepared that specific order. A pharmacy technician had made the error, confusing 2 medications with similar names. The technician was suspended pending investigation, and Dr. Frost gave another presentation about the importance of reading labels carefully and not rushing through preparation procedures. I couldn't prove anything about that incident, but the timing felt suspicious. The pharmacy technician who'd made the error was young and relatively new. Exactly the kind of person who might not question if Dr. Frost handed them the wrong medication to prepare, but I had no evidence she'd done that, no proof of anything except that another medication error had occurred in her department. I mentioned it to Julian during a follow-up call, and he added it to his investigation file, but he warned me again about jumping to conclusions without proof. He said investigators needed facts, not suspicions, and my pattern recognition was helpful for directing the investigation but couldn't substitute for concrete evidence. I understood what he meant, but understanding didn't make the waiting any easier. Month 4 of the investigation brought a break in the case that I hadn't expected. Julian called me at home late on a Saturday night, his voice tight with controlled excitement. He said they'd been reviewing hospital security footage as part of their investigation and had found something significant. In footage from the night Victor Alvarez received his fatal medication combination, there was a brief moment after the camera came back online where Dr. Frost could be seen handing the pharmacy resident a pre-prepared syringe while speaking to her about something. The angle made it impossible to see exactly what was in the syringe or what they were discussing, but the interaction happened right before the resident prepared Victor's medications. More importantly, the metadata from the camera system showed that the camera hadn't malfunctioned naturally. Someone with technical knowledge had deliberately triggered the offline mode, making it look like a routine technical issue. Julian explained that the medical board had brought in a forensic IT specialist who'd analyzed the camera system's logs. The specialist found evidence that someone had accessed the system remotely and sent a command to disable that specific camera during that specific time window. The access came from a computer within the hospital's network, but the user had logged in with generic administrative credentials that multiple people could access. Dr. Frost, as chief pharmacist, had those credentials for legitimate reasons related to managing pharmacy systems. The specialist couldn't prove she'd been the one to disable the camera, but combined with her physical presence during the incident and the suspicious timing, it added another piece to the circumstantial case. Julian said they were now reviewing camera footage from all the previous incidents to see if similar patterns existed. The investigation accelerated after that discovery. Julian's team interviewed everyone who'd worked with Dr. Frost at our hospital and her previous ones. They subpoenaed medical records and pharmacy logs going back years. They brought in pharmaceutical experts to review the medications involved in each suspicious death and determine whether the errors could have been genuinely accidental or required intentional manipulation. The process took another 3 months, during which I continued working in pediatrics and watching from a distance as the investigation unfolded. Dr. Frost seemed unaware that anything was happening, continuing her normal work routine and maintaining her reputation as a dedicated professional. I wondered sometimes if I'd been wrong about everything, if my suspicions were just paranoid pattern matching applied to tragic but random events. Then Julian called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked me to come to the medical board's offices the next morning. He said they'd completed their investigation and were preparing to present findings to the board's disciplinary committee. He wanted me there as the original complainant to hear the results and provide any final input before formal charges were filed. I took a personal day and drove to the state capitol, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I thought about what might happen. Part of me hoped I'd been wrong about Dr. Frost, that the investigation would clear her and prove the deaths were just terrible coincidences, but a larger part of me knew I'd been right from the beginning, and I was about to find out just how right I'd been. The medical board's conference room was formal and intimidating, with a long table surrounded by board members and investigators. Julian presented the findings in a clinical, methodical voice that made the horror of what he was describing somehow worse. The investigation had identified 9 deaths across Dr. Frost's 3 hospital employments that showed suspicious patterns consistent with intentional medication manipulation. In each case, Dr. Frost had been present during critical moments when medications were prepared or delivered. In several cases, she'd been alone with patients shortly before they experienced fatal complications. In the cases where security cameras existed, there were unexplained gaps in footage or evidence of technical tampering. In every single case, another healthcare worker had been blamed, while Dr. Frost had actively participated in investigating the errors that she herself had caused. The forensic pharmaceutical analysis was damning. The experts had reviewed the specific medication combinations and dosages involved in each death and concluded that the errors were too precise to be accidental. Someone with extensive pharmaceutical knowledge had deliberately prepared lethal doses or dangerous drug combinations, then delivered them in ways that made other people appear responsible. The timing of the errors, always during night shifts or busy periods when oversight was minimal, suggested careful planning rather than careless mistakes. Most significantly, the pattern of errors had followed Dr. Frost across 3 different hospitals with completely different systems and protocols, which indicated the common factor was her presence, not systemic problems with how the hospitals operated. The psychological profile was perhaps the most disturbing part of Julian's presentation. The medical board had consulted with a forensic psychologist who specialized in healthcare worker violence. The psychologist described a pattern consistent with what's known as medical murder, or angel of death syndrome, where healthcare workers harm patients for complex psychological reasons, often related to power, control, and attention-seeking behavior. In Dr. Frost's case, the psychologist noted that she'd positioned herself as an expert on medication safety and had benefited professionally from each incident. After deaths occurred on her watch, she'd been given additional responsibilities for investigating errors, implementing new protocols, and training staff. She'd built her entire reputation on preventing the very problems she was secretly causing, creating a perfect system where her crimes actually enhanced her professional standing. The board members asked questions for over an hour, challenging different aspects of the investigation and pushing Julian to address any weaknesses in the case. Could the pattern be coincidental? No. The statistical analysis showed the probability was essentially 0. Could other people have been responsible for some deaths? Possible, but unlikely given how consistently Dr. Frost had been present and positioned to manipulate medications. Could the camera tampering be blamed on someone else? Technically, yes, but Dr. Frost was the only person present at all the relevant incidents who had the technical knowledge and access credentials required. By the end of the questioning, the board members looked grim but convinced. The chair called for a vote on whether to file formal charges and recommend immediate license suspension. The vote was unanimous. I left the building feeling numb and vindicated and horrified all at once. 9 people dead, probably more that couldn't be proven, and Dr. Frost had gotten away with it for over a decade because everyone trusted her completely. She'd used her position and reputation as armor, hiding behind her role as the safety expert while systematically murdering vulnerable patients. The medical board would forward their findings to law enforcement for criminal investigation, and Julian said detectives would likely arrest her within days. I drove home trying to process what I'd learned, thinking about all the nurses and pharmacy technicians who'd lost their jobs and reputations because Dr. Frost had framed them for her crimes. Keisha Brooks's face kept appearing in my mind, her devastation when she'd been suspended after Gerald Thompson's death. How many others had carried that guilt and shame for errors they'd never made? The arrest happened on a Monday morning. Hospital security detained Dr. Frost at her desk in the pharmacy department, while police arrived to formally take her into custody. I wasn't there to see it, but the story spread through the hospital within minutes. Staff members were shocked, confused, unable to reconcile the respected pharmacist they'd worked with for years, with the serial killer being described in the arrest warrant. Our hospital administrator held an emergency meeting that afternoon to address the situation, and I attended along with several hundred other staff members crammed into the auditorium. The administrator looked shaken as he explained that Dr. Frost had been arrested on multiple charges of first-degree murder, and that the hospital was cooperating fully with the investigation. He said counseling services would be available for staff members who needed support processing this situation. During the Q&A portion of the meeting, someone asked why the hospital hadn't caught this sooner. The administrator deflected, saying the investigation had been incredibly complex and the evidence hadn't been clear until recently. I stood up and asked pointedly whether the hospital would be reaching out to all the staff members who'd been fired or suspended for medication errors that Dr. Frost had actually caused. The room went silent, and the administrator's face got tight as he said they'd be reviewing all previous incidents in light of recent revelations. I pressed harder, asking if the hospital took responsibility for destroying those people's careers while protecting a serial killer. The administrator said it wasn't appropriate to discuss personnel matters in a public forum, and I sat down to scattered applause from other staff members who clearly shared my anger. The criminal trial took 14 months to reach court. Dr. Frost pleaded not guilty to all charges, claiming the deaths were genuinely accidental errors made by other staff members, and that she was being scapegoated by a hospital trying to avoid liability. Her defense attorneys argued that the medical board's investigation was biased and that the pattern evidence was circumstantial at best. They brought in their own experts to testify that medication errors were common and that finding a healthcare worker present at multiple error scenes didn't prove causation. The trial became a media sensation, with reporters covering every day of testimony and legal analysts debating the case on news programs. I testified for 3 days about what I'd observed and the investigation I'd conducted. Dr. Frost stared at me the entire time I was on the stand, her expression neutral, but her eyes cold and calculating. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. They presented the pattern evidence showing Dr. Frost's presence at every suspicious death across 3 hospitals. They showed the camera tampering evidence and explained how she'd had the knowledge and access to disable the surveillance, They brought in the pharmacy resident who'd been blamed for Victor Alvarez's death, and she testified tearfully about how Dr. Frost had handed her a pre-prepared syringe that night and told her it was the correct medication. Overriding the safety warnings, they presented evidence that Dr. Frost had researched lethal drug interactions on her work computer days before several deaths occurred. Most damning, they played recordings of Dr. Frost giving presentations about medication safety, where she'd described in precise detail exactly the kind of errors that had killed her victims. She'd essentially confessed to her crimes while pretending to warn against them. The defense tried to paint Dr. Frost as a dedicated professional being persecuted for the failures of systemic healthcare problems. They argued she couldn't have acted alone to cause all these deaths, that hospital administrators and oversight systems had failed repeatedly. They tried to shift blame to the institutions where she'd worked, suggesting they'd covered up their own negligence by scapegoating one person. But the jury saw through it. After 6 days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder, assault, and evidence tampering. Dr. Frost's face remained blank as the verdicts were read, showing no emotion until the judge began discussing sentencing. Then her mask cracked just slightly, and I saw genuine fear flash across her features before she controlled it. The sentencing hearing brought more revelations. The prosecution presented evidence they had held back during trial, showing Dr. Frost had kept detailed notes about her crimes hidden in encrypted files on her personal computer. The notes described each victim and documented their deaths with clinical precision, sometimes including observations about how staff had reacted or how investigations had proceeded. The notes revealed she'd started with 1 death at her first hospital and had found the experience exciting enough to continue. Each subsequent killing had been more calculated and careful, refining her methods and improving her ability to avoid detection. The notes showed no remorse, no second thoughts, just cold satisfaction at successfully deceiving everyone around her while feeding what she described as her need to control life and death. The families of her victims gave impact statements during the sentencing hearing. Gerald Thompson's widow spoke about how she'd trusted the hospital to keep her husband safe, and instead they'd employed a serial killer who'd murdered him and then helped investigate his own death. Patricia Donnelly's adult children described their mother's fear in her final hours, and the years they'd spent believing a nurse had made a terrible mistake. Victor Alvarez's parents talked about their son's potential and how Dr. Frost had stolen his entire future for no reason they could understand. By the time the 9th family finished speaking, several jury members were crying. The judge sentenced Dr. Frost to 7 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, ensuring she'd die in prison. As bailiffs led her away, she turned to look at me one final time, and I saw something in her expression that might have been respect or hatred or both. The hospital settled lawsuits with the families for undisclosed amounts and implemented sweeping changes to medication safety protocols. They installed additional cameras, created redundant verification systems, and hired an independent safety monitor to review all medication-related incidents. They also reached out to former staff members who'd been blamed for Dr. Frost's crimes and offered financial settlements along with public acknowledgement that they'd been wrongly accused. Keisha Brooks accepted her settlement but told reporters she'd never return to nursing after what she'd been through. 2 other nurses who'd been fired said the same thing. The hospital had protected a serial killer for years and destroyed innocent people's careers in the process, and money couldn't fix that damage. I testified before a state legislative committee investigating how Dr. Frost had evaded detection for so long. The committee was looking at systemic failures that allowed healthcare workers to move between institutions carrying hidden histories of suspicious deaths. I explained how Dr. Frost had exploited gaps in background checking and information sharing between hospitals. I described how her position of authority and reputation had made her essentially immune to suspicion until someone took the time to connect patterns across multiple institutions. The committee drafted legislation requiring mandatory reporting of all medication-related deaths to a central database and creating protocols for investigating healthcare workers who'd been present at multiple suspicious incidents. The law passed unanimously and was nicknamed the Frost Protocol in media coverage. Julian Reeves called me 6 months after the sentencing to say the medical board had identified 3 additional suspicious deaths they believed Dr. Frost had caused, but couldn't prove well enough for criminal charges. He said there might be more that would never be discovered, because records had been destroyed, or evidence had degraded over time. The actual victim count could be 15 or 20 people, possibly more if she'd started experimenting during her training years before anyone was watching. He thanked me for pursuing the case when everyone else had dismissed my concerns, saying my persistence had saved lives even if we couldn't quantify exactly how many. I appreciated his words, but they didn't erase the guilt I felt for not acting sooner or pushing harder when the hospital tried to silence me. I left bedside nursing a year after the trial ended. The stress of working in an environment where I'd watched a colleague murder patients for over a decade had burned me out completely. I'd lost faith in hospital systems and the people who ran them, and I couldn't shake the paranoia that made me question every medication and every procedure. I took a position as a patient safety consultant, working with hospitals to improve their protocols and train staff to recognize warning signs of healthcare worker violence. I used Dr. Frost's case as a teaching example, walking through how she'd exploited trust and authority to commit her crimes. Some administrators resented the harsh lessons, but others listened carefully and implemented real changes. I'd found a way to channel my trauma into work that might prevent future Dr. Frosts from succeeding. 5 years after her conviction, I received a letter from Dr. Frost. She'd been moved to a maximum security medical facility for inmates with serious health conditions, and she'd apparently decided to reach out to the person who'd exposed her crimes. The letter was surprisingly cordial, thanking me for being observant and persistent where others had failed. She wrote that she'd known I was suspicious of her long before I'd filed the complaint, but had assumed I'd never gather enough evidence to matter. She said watching me investigate had been intellectually interesting, like a game where she'd thought she was staying ahead until suddenly she wasn't. The letter contained no apology to her victims or their families, no expression of remorse or explanation for why she'd killed, just cold analysis of how she'd been caught, and acknowledgement that I'd beaten her. I burned the letter without responding because she didn't deserve any validation or attention. The pharmacy resident who'd been initially blamed for Victor Alvarez's death graduated from her program and found work at a different hospital. She contacted me during her first year of practice to say she'd been following the patient safety training I was providing and appreciated how I emphasized protecting vulnerable staff from manipulation by authority figures. She said Dr. Frost had targeted her specifically because she was young and unsure of herself, deliberately putting her in a position to take the blame. Understanding that she'd been used rather than incompetent had helped her rebuild her confidence. Though she still had nightmares about the night Victor died, I told her those nightmares proved she had the conscience required to be a good pharmacist, that caring about patients enough to be haunted by their deaths was exactly what the profession needed. We stayed in touch after that. Occasional emails sharing resources and experiences as we both worked to process our trauma through helping others. The hospital where I'd worked for 7 years never fully recovered its reputation. Patient admissions declined steadily as families chose other facilities, and talented staff members left for positions elsewhere. The administration tried to rebrand and advertise their improved safety protocols, but the association with Dr. Frost's crimes was too strong. 3 years after the trial, they were bought by a larger healthcare system that immediately brought in new management and implemented sweeping changes. The surgical unit where I'd worked was renamed, the pharmacy was relocated to a different floor, and they tried to create physical distance from the spaces where murders had occurred. I don't know if it worked, but I know I could never walk through those hallways again without seeing the faces of the patients Dr. Frost had killed. 10 years after exposing Dr. Frost, I was invited to speak at a national conference on healthcare worker violence. The organizers wanted me to tell my story as an example of successful intervention by an observant colleague. I stood on that stage looking out at hundreds of healthcare professionals and told them the truth that most didn't want to hear. Dr. Frost had gotten away with murder for over a decade because people trusted authority and reputation more than they trusted their own observations and instincts. She'd exploited the healthcare system's tendency to blame low-level workers for systemic problems rather than investigating powerful people with pristine reputations. She'd understood that hospitals would protect their image by finding scapegoats, instead of confronting the possibility that a respected professional might be a serial killer. The system had worked exactly as designed to enable her crimes, and fixing it required more than new protocols or cameras. It required cultural change that made questioning authority acceptable and protecting reputations less important than protecting patients. The audience was silent when I finished speaking. Some looked uncomfortable with the harsh critique of healthcare culture. Others nodded in recognition of truths they'd witnessed but rarely acknowledged publicly. During the Q&A, a nurse asked how she could distinguish between legitimate concern about a colleague and paranoid suspicion that would damage innocent people's careers. I told her to document everything. Trust patterns over single incidents. And remember that good people don't get defensive when questioned about patient safety. I said the difference between me and the administrators who'd dismissed my concerns was that I'd been willing to be wrong if it meant protecting patients, while they'd been more concerned with protecting Dr. Frost's reputation and the hospital's image. That willingness to prioritize patients over politics was what separated healthcare workers from healthcare bureaucrats. Dr. Frost died in prison during her 18th year of incarceration. The death was officially attributed to complications from diabetes that she'd refused to manage properly, essentially a slow suicide through medical neglect. Part of me felt satisfied that she'd died behind bars, denied the power and control she'd craved. Another part felt cheated that she'd escaped without ever explaining why she'd killed or showing genuine remorse for destroying so many lives. Her death made the news briefly, with articles recounting her crimes and the systemic failures that had enabled them. Several journalists called asking for my reaction, and I gave the same statement to all of them. I said I was glad she'd never be able to hurt anyone else, and I hoped her case continued to serve as a warning about how easily trust could be exploited by people determined to do harm. 20 years after filing my initial complaint, I retired from patient safety consulting and wrote a book about the Dr. Frost case. The book examined how healthcare systems create conditions where trusted professionals can commit crimes for years without detection. I interviewed other nurses who'd exposed dangerous colleagues and faced retaliation for speaking up. I documented the psychological techniques serial killers in healthcare use to avoid suspicion and frame innocent coworkers. I included detailed analysis of what hospitals could do differently to catch these predators before body counts accumulated. The book became required reading in several healthcare administration programs and nursing schools, and I received hundreds of messages from students and professionals saying it had changed how they thought about authority and trust in medical settings. Looking back now from the distance of decades, I understand that Dr. Frost succeeded as long as she did because she'd identified a fundamental weakness in how humans operate. We want to trust authority figures and experts. We want to believe people in positions of responsibility are worthy of that responsibility. Questioning respected professionals feels uncomfortable and risky, especially when you're lower in the hierarchy. Dr. Frost had exploited that discomfort expertly, building a reputation as a safety expert that made questioning her seem absurd. She'd understood that the best place to hide was in plain sight, that becoming the person investigating errors meant no one would investigate her. It had been a perfect strategy until someone had been willing to risk everything to connect patterns everyone else had dismissed as coincidence. The families of her victims found various ways to cope with their losses, and the knowledge that a trusted healthcare worker had murdered their loved ones. Some became advocates for healthcare reform, testifying before legislative committees and meeting with hospital administrators to push for better safety protocols. Others withdrew from public life, unable to process the betrayal and trauma publicly. Gerald Thompson's widow started a foundation supporting wrongfully accused healthcare workers, using her settlement money to provide legal assistance and counseling to nurses and technicians who'd been scapegoated for systemic failures. She called me once to thank me for clearing Keisha Brooks's name, saying she couldn't give her husband back to her, but could at least ensure the person blamed for his death was exonerated. That conversation stayed with me as one of the hardest and most meaningful of my life. The medical board investigator Julian Reeves retired 5 years after the Frost case concluded and wrote his own book about investigating healthcare professionals. He credited my persistence with breaking open a case that had baffled oversight agencies for years. He described how my detailed documentation and willingness to pursue patterns across multiple institutions had provided the foundation for a successful investigation. He also wrote honestly about the medical board's initial reluctance to investigate a respected pharmacist based on one nurse's suspicions, acknowledging that bureaucratic inertia and deference to authority had nearly let Dr. Frost escape accountability yet again. His book became a training manual for investigators handling complaints about licensed professionals, emphasizing the importance of taking every concern seriously, regardless of the accused person's reputation or standing. I never returned to bedside nursing after leaving my hospital job, but I never stopped caring about patient safety or thinking about the people I'd worked with during those terrible years I attended Keisha Brooks's wedding when she remarried after divorcing during her depression following the false accusations. I wrote letters of recommendation for the pharmacy resident when she applied for advanced positions. I stayed in touch with Julian and Constance and several other people whose lives had intersected with the Dr. Frost case. We'd all been changed by exposure to that kind of calculated evil, and we'd all found different ways to process the trauma and channel it into something productive. Some days I felt like we'd won by stopping her and changing systems to prevent future Frosts. Other days I felt like we'd lost because 9 people were dead and dozens of careers were damaged before anyone had taken action. The question that haunted me most over the years was how many other Dr. Frosts existed in healthcare systems across the country. How many trusted professionals were using their positions and reputations to harm patients while deflecting blame onto vulnerable coworkers? Statistics suggested healthcare worker violence was rare, but those statistics relied on catching perpetrators, and Dr. Frost had proven how easy it was to avoid detection for decades. Every suspicious death that got blamed on human error, every medication mistake that destroyed a nurse's career, every patient who died unexpectedly despite receiving appropriate care, any of those could be hidden murders that no one had connected into patterns yet. The thought kept me awake sometimes, knowing that my success with one case didn't mean I'd solved the larger problem of how trust and authority could be weaponized against the people healthcare systems were meant to protect. In the end, Dr. Amelia Frost got away with sabotage for over a decade because everyone trusted her too much to question whether the medication safety expert might be the one causing medication deaths. And by the time anyone connected the patterns she'd left across 3 hospitals and 9 murders, she'd destroyed countless lives while building a reputation as the person who prevented exactly what she was doing. A perfect camouflage that nearly succeeded until one nurse refused to accept that tragic coincidences could be that perfectly timed. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.